that shows that Australia can reduce global emissions by 10%. That's just about as many emissions as the United States has.
It is.
It's more emissions than the European Union has by exporting zero carbon goods. And that will happen if we get the economics right.
Welcome to Climate 360 and a new series of conversations about the impacts of a changing climate and some of the brilliant people making a difference. When we started out on this journey, it was in response to our observation that familiar silos of industry, academia, business and government can leave unintended barriers that prevent or slow our progress. So one of the key things we wanted to do was to take a big topic such as building and explode it into a wide range of different perspectives. And that's something that we hope you've had a chance to see in some of our previous episodes. Our hunch is that we might reveal connections between disparate fields of knowledge and in this way help to build a broader conversation across some of these silos, dissolving barriers to climate change, mitigation and adaptation. The journey that we're all on, and it's very inspiring to listen to some very committed people.
Now, as Sam says, there is a tendency to be divided into silos. There's also sometimes a tendency to be daunted by the news coming out about climate. And with the second series, we wanted to kind of face on directly this question of how do we maintain momentum. This isn't a question of being positive in a blind optimism sense, that it'll be okay if we just keep muddling along, but rather actually how do we give agency to hope? And we thought we would speak to people, 5 different people, and in different, let's say, scales of working, starting with, let's say, Australia's role in the world, then moving into the corporate world and what corporate responsibility looks like. Then looking at research and academia and how it feeds into policy. Then looking at communities and how communities are driving positive change. And then finally looking at us as individuals and how we as people respond to this rolling story of crisis and change. And so that's the perspective we want to bring to this, not a Pollyanna attitude that everything will be okay and we just have to keep battling on, but rather actually there's important lessons to be learned from people who've been in the trenches, let's say, one way or the other for quite a while. We couldn't hope to have a better person to kick off this series than Ross Garnaut, who, as some of you will know, has been in the public eye and an advisor to government policy for half a century. He's been an advisor into climate policy for at least 2 decades. He's the head of the Superpower Institute here in Melbourne, which you would have to say is a very positive attitude for an institution to have. And we were very happy to sit down with him for an hour. So we hope you enjoy that conversation. So welcome to this episode of Climate 360 today. I'm with Ross Garnaut. And I guess you could say that no one has done more in Australia to draw the dots together between economics and climate change than Ross. Has made a big impact on the Australian conversation. But rather than me giving you a bio, maybe Ross, could you start us off with just a brief introduction to your background, and I guess what puts you in a position back in 2007 or whatever to be tapped on the shoulder by a future Prime Minister to basically tell him what you would be doing in relation to economics and climate change? Where did that come from?
Well, I'm an economist who's worked on development development economics in Asia and in Southwest Pacific and international economics for a very long time. My PhD was on the Southeast Asian economies and their international relations back in the 60s.
The 60s, okay. Well, I was born.
And I suppose my first big engagement in public policy was as an economist getting involved in the case for opening up the Australian economy, and it took 15 years from the first time I wrote about that to starting to have an effect when Bob Hawke became Prime Minister, and Bob Hawke asked me to be his economic advisor the day after he became Prime Minister. was deeply engaged in the work on reforms that era is known for.
Yeah.
One of the things that became important in those early years was Hawke developed a close relationship with the Premier of China, Jiang, discussing economic reform in China and Australia, and it became clear to us that that was going to be a major part of Australia's economic future
Yes.
opportunity, and for those reasons I was sent as Australian ambassador to China for a few years, and my job was to link us, to encourage the reforms, and we were very close to the Chinese leadership at the time, so there was an opportunity to do that.
Yeah.
But also to make sure Australia was closely linked to the reforms, and they were the days when we got the large-scale iron ore trade going. Tried to get the metallurgical coal trade going, but that was harder. We laid the foundation, and that grew later. And I didn't then, of course, understand all of the climate implications of burning metallurgical coal.
Yeah.
But in those days, we worked with the Chinese to develop the first 2 Chinese investments abroad under the open policies, which were both in Australia, the aluminium smelter in Portland, and a joint venture in iron ore. And so after that, back to the ANU, wrote that report, which became very much discussed in Australia, very influential. Australia and the Northeast Asian ascendancy given to the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister in '89. Back at ANU then, working on building up the ANU's capacity on in economics of development and international economics, and then I always did a lot of other things alongside that, some business things, some policy things alongside being an academic. I chaired the board of the International Food Policy Research Institute in the early 2000s, which probably is the world's main economic research institution focused on rural development in developing countries. And that's when it became clear to me that climate change was a major issue, in fact the major threat to food security in the developing world.
Right.
Not only the developing world, but most importantly the developing world, most importantly South Asia and Africa.
What period would that have been?
Well, 2002 onwards, and I was chair of the board of the International Food Policy Research Institute when I was asked to do the first climate change review. I had a meeting, the states had decided to do something because the Commonwealth wasn't, and so all of the states and territories, 6 prime ministers, 2 chief ministers, commissioned my first review with an invitation for the Commonwealth to join. If it wanted to. Mr. Howard declined, but Mr. Rudd, as leader of the opposition, said they would join if and when he became Prime Minister. So from December in '07, it became a joint federal and state exercise. I gave my report to the Prime Minister and the state premiers in I think it was September '08, and the rest is history.
It was, yeah. We're coming up to the anniversary, 30th of September, in fact. Yes. Give us a picture of the mood at that moment, because you could safely say that a lot has happened in the 17 years since then, and we can talk about where we are now. But back then, can we just spool back to 2008 in terms of, like, what was the scope? You know, one of the qualities of any conversation about climate change is that it's potentially infinite almost in its scope. And so one of the challenges is to figure out where do you start and end, or what are the key things you need to look at. So what did you consider was the scope?
I suppose that first climate change review was infinite in its scope, 650 pages, unconscionably long. But it's a bit of work I'm very happy with. In a long professional life, there's some things that you got done and you're glad you just got them done, and there's other things you're pretty happy about in retrospect. That's one of those I'm happy about in retrospect. It stands up pretty well. It looked at... I had a very strong secretariat. Initially, funded and provided by the states. And then we had funding for consultancies for bringing others in. And we were able to call on the best climate science in a series of consultancies. And so we set out to look at the costs and the benefits of Australia doing its fair share in the global effort to combat climate change. Up till then, we quite explicitly hadn't been doing our fair share. We'd rejected the idea of doing our fair share. We had been part of the negotiations that led to the Kyoto Convention in 1997, which was really the first global agreement that came up with concrete proposals and for doing something about the problem. We signed on to that in principle. We were part of the agreement of it, so was the United States. But two developed countries pulled out of it, didn't go ahead and ratify it. One was the US was going to. Then you had Clinton as president and Gore as prime minister. But when Bush became president, he said he would not ratify the Kyoto Agreement, and his deputy sheriff said, "Me too." And so Australia, having said it would, having been part of the agreement, then declined to sign on to the Kyoto Protocols. But so we hadn't been even trying to pull our weight in the global effort. But Kevin Rudd had been making climate an issue in the run-up to what became the 2007 election. And really, in recognition that there was a fair community interest in doing something, in not being a drag on the global effort. Howard instituted a study on how we could introduce an emissions trading scheme, and that study was due to report after the election. Rudd joined the Climate Change Review after the change of government late in 2007. We had a rather unusual situation in Australia. We had a big public policy exercise in which all of the state and territory governments, as well as the Commonwealth, were joined. They were all supporting the effort and contributing to it. But not only that, the opposition was strongly engaged. From after the change of government, I had regular meetings with the opposition. Malcolm Turnbull was leader. He'd bring together the main relevant figures from his front bench, and from time to time we'd have a discussion about how things were going. The leader of the opposition entered into some negotiations with the government on details of implementation of the recommendations, but made it clear they were going to support the legislation in the Senate. So legislation implementing my recommendation, part of it was the emissions trading scheme, but a lot more than that. And that had that was passed through the House of Representatives, the legislation, and had the support of the opposition, and of course with the coalition support in the Senate, it would have passed through the Senate. At the time, in that Parliament, the Greens and the Labour Party did not have the majority. To get a majority in the Senate, you had to have the coalition on board. And Malcolm Turnbull said he would support it. And then the day before the Senate vote, there were Tony Abbott defeated
the day before
Malcolm Turnbull for the leadership of the Liberal Party by a single vote. And so what had been passed through the House of Representatives didn't go through the Senate.
The course of history changed with a single vote.
But until then, and that was December 2009, when you had the Senate vote, more than a year after my report. And until then, we had this rather unusual situation of Commonwealth government, all the state governments, the territory governments, and the opposition in support. We haven't had anything like that ever since. Tony Abbott broke the consensus, and since then this has been a difficult and contentious matter, and Australia suffered from it. Of course, you'll probably want to know about the next step, the second review, but I'll let you ask about that.
Well, maybe we could talk just briefly, not to get too technical, but if we could talk a little bit about the ETS and what it was attempting to do, because of course, more recently you've produced that your more recent book on taxing carbon, and I'm interested in kind of digging into that a little bit. So, could you describe the broad parameters of the ETS that was put forward, and how it would have worked?
Yeah, the emissions trading scheme required firms in sectors covered by the scheme. Not the whole economy was covered. The idea was that sooner or later it would all be covered, but initially some sectors, most importantly agriculture, wasn't.
Yes.
But all of the covered sectors, if you emitted greenhouse gases, you had to have a permit as a certificate. There'd be a certain number of permits issued by the Commonwealth Government. And that number was equal to the amount of carbon dioxide that we into the atmosphere that we thought corresponded to Australia's fair share in the global effort. We're a little bit generous in defining that fair share. There's a chapter in the report discussing how we got to that, and we gave a little bit of a free kick to countries that had a history of high emissions. Because the idea was that all countries would converge on very low emissions at some time in future. So that those who started high, we were the world champions,
of course,
the highest per capita in the developed world.
Yeah.
So we would stay high, but would have to come down to a common very low point at a certain time in the future.
Yeah.
So the formula was one that I judged had a chance of being acceptable internationally. I talked to Indian economists, for example, about it, and there seemed to be a chance of that being acceptable, but we do have to recognise it was fairly generous to Australia. Then the number of permits issued would be reduced in line with the required reduction in emissions, so the pressures to reduce emissions would increase over time.
Yes.
Most of the permits would be sold by auction.
Yes.
And so if you were a high emitting industry, if you were running a steel mill, for example, you had to buy emissions to cover it.
Yeah.
And because the number of emissions being sold was falling over time, you'd expect the price to rise over time.
You would.
The government would sell those by auction, and that would create a price, and that price would go into government revenue. It was going to be a major source of government revenue. That revenue was used partly, substantially actually, for tax cuts for low and middle income earners. The mechanism worked out with Treasury was to raise the tax-free threshold by rather a large amount.
Right.
And then to make adjustments to some social security payments because the cost increases in the cost of living associated with the introduction of the carbon pricing would have had a disproportionate effect on some low income social security. So there was some adjustment to social security. So it was all designed so there'd be no negative effects on the living standards of low and middle income Australians. Now, the scheme was designed. One special feature of the scheme was that it introduced the idea of carbon farming credits. That if it was called the Carbon Farming Initiative, there were some rules, and if you met these specified conditions, which certified that you were increasing carbon in soil or in plants, you could get credits. And that steel mill, to comply with the law, could pay the carbon price or buy permits from the government, or it could buy credits from the farm sector.
farmers, right, okay.
So it would create a new industry of farm credits. Another feature was that it was due to, initially from the 1st of July 2015, the new scheme, the linkage to Europe came with the second scheme, the one that was actually legislated. But I described the main elements of the first scheme.
So what I'm interested there is that obviously what you're looking at there is market mechanisms that you believe the economy could get behind, that the political economy could get behind. Some of those calculations are pegged to things like part per million of carbon dioxide, 450, and presumably that feeds into, therefore, a conversation around science and temperatures, etc. One thing I'm interested to know is that we've seen over the last 20 years or more, those numbers and the information that comes out of science, in a way, it becomes increasingly, it changes, you know. We start with an idea of what we need to get, what we need to be in terms of ppm to be able to keep the 2%. But then somebody over there realizes that actually this is happening in one part of the world, or there's an effect happening. There's lots of volatility, and increasingly we're getting much better at climate science. But in the early days, there were a lot of things were being slightly undercooked, you know, being conservative. Let's not go with a higher estimation. Let's go with something that's a bit more manageable. And then we discover, lo and behold, 10 years later, actually it was worse than what they thought it was. Yeah. And so that connection between science knowledge and what economics can allow to happen, as it were, that's really interesting to me, because that seems to me that's an ongoing dynamic.
Yes, the international agreement on objectives for reducing emissions was driven by the science, and driven by a judgment, ultimately a political judgment within the United Nations framework of what was the right trade-off between limiting climate change and the cost of the adjustment to the economy. Of course, if all you were interested in doing was removing climate damage, you would have had zero emissions right now.
Yeah.
Because we're causing damage right now.
Yeah.
Every ton of carbon that goes up in the atmosphere, every ton of steel made from coal, damages, kills someone somewhere.
Totally.
But it's always been recognised that you have to make a trade-off between the damage that you do and the cost of dealing with the damage, because you can't get to net zero overnight, and so that judgment was ultimately to be made in the UNFCCC, in an international framework. Now, those judgments had not been defined precisely at that time. They came to be defined in a series of steps, discussions at Copenhagen in 2009, at Cancun in 2010, most importantly Paris in 2015, and that's when we got some fairly close agreement on objectives. But all the objectives were informed by science and by economics. And the science, we had access to the best Australian science, but also we're reading deeply into the international science, and we didn't pretend to be the experts in that, but we did a very conscientious job of translating into our work the best knowledge. And the really interesting thing to me about that is how little the main conclusions have changed in 15 years. Well, time goes quickly. 18 years since we started that work. There has been reduction in uncertainty. There was a wider range of credible possible outcomes earlier on than there is now. There's tend to be still a recognition of uncertainty, but the uncertainty has been falling over time.
It has,
both about what increased greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere will do to temperature. the amazing thing is that what looks right now is not very different to what was estimated by the first atmospheric physicists in the late 19th century.
Right.
We've got much stronger grounds for knowing it now.
Yeah.
But the actual
Yeah.
basic idea that if the concentrations of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere double, there'll be a 3-degree average global increase in temperature. That was the original calculation. It's not all that far from that today.
Yeah.
But the range of uncertainty has been falling. Probably, and then there's another step, of course. What damage does a certain level of increase in temperature do?
Yes.
So that's another area of uncertainty.
Yes. Yes.
And here you have to start by looking at complex climate models, because higher temperature changes world wind patterns. And while on average an Earth with a higher temperature will have more water vapor in the atmosphere and more rain, and more extreme climatic events will be more extreme. There's more energy in the atmosphere. That's on average, but there'll be regional variations in that.
Yeah.
For example, one that's very important in Australia, most of the climate models have always said that with warming, the wind patterns, to be very specific, the winter wind patterns that bring rain to southern Australia and drive a very high proportion of our wheat and agricultural production will shift further south in a warmer world.
Right.
The rain still falls, but in the Southern Ocean instead of the wheat belt of West Australia, South Australia, and Victoria, and southern New South Wales.
Yep.
And that can have a huge effect on agricultural productivity. So that was but the meteorological models are complex, and everyone, including the people who work on them, recognises uncertainty about that. That's where I think that some scientific reticence has been important, some understatement of impact, partly because of innate conservatism. If you're coming to conclusions that are very disruptive to the world, and shocking in a way, and you know there's some uncertainty about it, you tend to understate them, so as not to be seen as being extreme.
It's interesting though, because that you're right. That does seem to be a tendency, and yet it depends on what you look at. Because if you were building a bridge and you were an engineer, and you were to work out what the break point was for the load on that bridge, your estimation would be and this is every day, was to wildly overestimate how much concrete you need or whatever that material is to make that support, because the impact is so catastrophic. So that's what I find kind of curious about that dynamic between, do you go with the worst case or the best case? Because if you're engineering a bridge, you go with the worst case to make sure it doesn't fail. But we have consistently for decades kind of gone with the best case.
Yeah. Well, not the best case, but a case that's a bit better than what has actually happened. No, it was always a wider range of uncertainty than that. They could have gone with a better case. No.
I guess what I'm pointing to is one curve from the science community where things seem to be getting worse.
Yeah, I think the political environment is relevant there. That it's to be concerned about climate and want society to do something about it, and to carry the political leadership of the countries that matter in this, you've got to go through a political process.
Of course.
And there's a lot of people who will be worse off from early action on climate change. If you own a whole lot of coal or gas or oil, you'll be worse off if the world takes you seriously.
Although one might question the lot of people versus the Australian.
That's right, but
population.
those people are disproportionately influential in our political system. And our political system is nowhere near as bad as the United States.
Yes,
money gets many more votes than people, and the big oil and gas and coal companies very very valuable in purely commercial terms, a lot of wealth.
Yes.
A lot of wealth to invest in the political system. We see similar things in protection. When we're trying to get rid of Australian protection, there was a fight between the general interest in a more liberal trade environment and the vested interests of protected industries in keeping what they had. And the people who and the vested interests who would be damaged by trade liberalisation were concentrated, and they knew who they were. The beneficiaries didn't know who they were. They were beneficiaries over time, in future, dispersed amongst a lot of people, whereas the people would be hurt by something that was of the benefit for Australia as a whole, getting rid of protection, were concentrated, knew who they were, invested heavily in the political system, political donations to both sides of politics. Well, something very similar here. The vested interests who would lose from action, very concentrated, particularly wealthy, especially in Australia, where we don't really tax mineral rents the way every other country in the world, even the United States, does more effectively than we do. That's a particular failure of mine, because I was writing about these things half a century ago. Obviously,
it's quite notable, particularly if you look at Norway, for instance, and their sovereign wealth fund.
But not just Norway, the Middle East.
Totally. Look at Qatar and what they're doing with their
great Commonwealth wealth funds that invest in Australia, buy up Australian assets very easily.
Okay, that's a whole other depressing line of inquiry.
Yeah, that's right. But anyway, this concentration of wealth in the vested interest that would be damaged by by action on climate change, against the dispersion throughout the community of the benefits. That biases the political equation. And then in the English-speaking world, there's another variable, a unique one in the United States, UK and Australia, and that is one very important media company that found some combination of ideological and business interest in supporting resistance to action on climate change. And if you look at the spectrum of world opinion, it's different in the UK, Australia and the US than it is in other countries. It's doing something on climate might be difficult in China or Japan or Germany or France or Nigeria or India, but you don't have a respectable part of the community denying the scientific realities. You do in these three countries. There was a study in political science at Oxford University when I was finishing off my second climate change review that attributed the difference between these three English-speaking countries, difference in the spectrum of opinion, to the role of News Corp. And obviously that has not diminished since 2013. So back to your original point, question. In advocacy of action on climate change, country by country, you do have to take account of these different political realities. Climate scientists have been hounded mercilessly for telling the truth from time to time, both by vested interests and by the media perspectives. And that does affect personal behaviour. Scientists are human,
of course,
they find themselves adjusting to that.
Yeah, I mean, and that makes sense, but it does go to the heart of an interesting question that I find myself asking, which is the relative importance of capitalism and the kind of changes that might be necessary within the capitalist mode to address the real existential challenges of climate change. And so far as we have writers and we have thinkers, we have people looking at climate change that go the full spectrum from, in a sense, the market's pretty good. We need some tweaks, we need some regulation, and it can carry on doing kind of what it does, and that will work. And then you have at kind of, I guess, the other end of the spectrum, people say that actually the changes are such a paradigmatic and so substantial, and the market is failing so badly in parts of the world that actually we need to think about the role of the state more substantively. What is that relationship we currently have between the state as a decision maker and the market having a decision maker? And that seems to be very interesting, because there's some people, I don't know if you know, Brett Christophers, who wrote that book, The Price is Wrong. He talked about energy, particularly at a moment when things like PV and wind, the price is essentially going through the floor. And a lot of people saying this is amazing. But he examines it almost as a problem, insofar as we have circumstances where the market is finding less and less opportunity to actually make a profit in the way they used to make a profit of fossil fuels. And so there's a question around whether the market itself can in fact pick up the slack, can actually, given the big upfront costs of PV, of renewables, whether those circumstances will work. Because ironically, you get this kind of weird, what they call cannibalism of the price, where because the renewables brings down the price, it almost means that investors into the market of energy think, well, actually it's worth less now. So should I? So I guess what I'm saying is a broader question around where do you feel about the relative role of the market versus the state?
Well, that's always the critical issue in economic development in general. And this is what I spent my life working on long before I got into climate. And I've written about the market and the state in development for half a century.
Yes.
The general story is that society only works and economic development only works if you get the right balance between the market and the state. If you have a excessively heavy state, it stultifies innovation, the value of exchange, and you don't get economic development. If you have a complete absence of the state, you have anarchy. You don't get economic development there. And so economic development happens successfully when you get the right balance. And in some periods of history, some countries have got that balance right and have done very well. The emergence of modern economic development, the last quarter of the 18th century in Britain, spreading through continental Europe and the overseas regions of recent European settlement in the Americas, Australia, New Zealand. That from about the Napoleonic Wars, from the settlements of the Napoleonic Wars, from about 1815 through the 19th century. After the Second World War, spreading to more and more of the rest of the world as we got rid of the empires that put excessively heavy states on the developing world, take that away from India, and you started to get modern economic development, although they had an excessively heavy state for a while, but are gradually getting out that. But economic development happens when you get the right balance between these things. Now, the role of the state has to be managed very well. There are certain basic services that will not be supplied at all, and that services are essential for development that will not be supplied at all if you don't have the state doing them, and an effective state doing them. Most obviously, the system of law, and which the market depends on. You
yes,
have
of course.
Yeah. But much more than that. There's a provision of certain public goods. And if you want it to be a democracy as well as a market economy, then you have to limit the dispersion of incomes and wealth, or a democracy doesn't work. And the world was at its best in getting the balance right in the several decades after the Second World War. That was a period of in a sense, U.S. Hegemony.
Yeah.
Or you had the bifurcation of the Soviet Union, but most of the world was in that US sphere, and you had relatively open markets. You had the end of the heavy state of imperialism. And you started to get modern economic development. It depended on conditions in each country. You had to have a state able to deliver the essential services of the state, or you wouldn't get economic development. But generally in the world, there was a pretty good time. And a pretty good time in Britain, a pretty good time in America, very good time in Europe and Japan, which had extraordinarily rapid economic growth. In the big countries of the developing world, China, India, Indonesia, the big three, for the first couple of decades after the end of the imperial system, you had an excessively heavy but ineffective state. Maoism in China, in India, overemphasis on what became the regulatory Raj of democratic India. In Indonesia, you had the random interventions of the Sukarno government. But one after another, those countries started to get the balance right. Now, applying that to the current problem, market, you've got to get the right balance between the state and the market. Markets do not work. No good economist does not recognize that markets will not work if participants in the market are free to damage other people from what they do without paying for that damage. Markets just don't work if you have those external costs. They're called externalities in economics. And so markets will only work if people are either banned from doing things that hurt other people, or taxed for doing things that hurt other people, taxed an amount equal to the damage they do, or if the people who are doing other things that compete with the external costs are subsidized. The main difference between the three is that taxing the bads, you can get a solution in any of these three. The most efficient is to have the market do the job after correction for the external costs, and that's the carbon price. That's the most efficient, but the carbon price also brings the government a lot of revenue, and so that's another gain from that. You can reduce other taxes, as Australia did in 2013, or you can do other positive things with it. So market will not work unless you correct for the external costs, and even the extreme leaders of thought on non-government intervention in the economy, like von Hayek and Friedman, recognize that if you've got external costs, government has to correct them or markets won't work. And that's the role of the carbon price.
So with that question about the balance of the state and the economy and the markets, how do we rationalize the quite extraordinary contribution of China to climate mitigation and adaptation at the moment? Because we're in this kind of, from a European sensibility at least, a kind of a unusual situation where a country that is a one-party state and has been for a long time, that has a very, very significant, some would say draconian control over elements of its society, is also by far the most important economy in its response into climate. It creates an interesting dissonance in the historical trajectory where we have looked to the European model of social democratic institutions to provide the kind of things that we need to save us from ourselves. And yet at the moment, we'd all be somewhat sunk if it wasn't for the kind of stuff that China has been doing in recent years. And that's a bit of a dissonance to that logic, isn't it?
No, I don't think so. I think it proves the logic. China's, in this area,
Right.
I'm not talking about human rights. I'm not talking.
No. Yeah.
In this area,
Yeah.
China's done a better job of getting the balance right between the market and the state. Now, I mentioned that markets don't work if individual firms are able to damage others
Yes.
without paying for the damage, or without being banned from doing it, or without others being subsidized to compete with them. But there's another external effect that's very important. The innovator in any new economic activity creates benefits for others in society that they themselves can't capture.
Right.
And so you get more innovation if the public sector, if government pays the innovator for the benefits they give to everyone else. The first person in a company in Australia to apply grid scale solar, they will make a lot of mistakes. They will have to go through a whole lot of regulatory hurdles.
Yeah. The learning curve.
We will find when the first one tries it, that with a whole lot of council regulations, state regulation,
and all that.
And everything takes time and costs money, and you start to do something and you find you've done it wrong, you do it again. So the pioneers carry a lot of costs that others can learn from.
Yeah.
And that's why you don't get enough innovation if the state is not subsidizing innovation. It's the opposite really of the external costs of the carbon emissions.
Yeah.
You need to subsidize the innovation. And when you need to innovate very quickly, as we do in solving this climate problem quickly, the requirement support is even greater. Now, China took a view about the time my first report came out, that the world would have to deal with this climate problem, and that the economies that would do well in the future would be economies that were adjusted to that produced things that would be valuable in that economy.
Yes.
There was a lot of interest, for example, in my very thorough, unconscionably long climate change review.
Yeah.
The National Development Reform Commission, which is the main policy body for high-level policy in China, had it translated into Chinese and published by China Academic Press in Chinese. So it was widely read in China. When I'd visit the vice chairman of the National Development Reform Commission, who was responsible for climate and energy, he'd have a copy on the desk in Chinese. And I remember one conversation way back there in 2008 in which people in the National Development Reform Commission said, well, things are going to change fundamentally. China has to be at the front of that change. That is actually, they said to me then, that's actually an advantage to Australia for China. They said, we're trying to develop a car industry, but technologically Detroit and Nagoya, because they've been doing it for 30 or 40 years, or in the case of Detroit longer, it's very hard to pass them. We can get closer to them. It's very hard to pass them, but if the technology of the future are going to be completely different, we can get ahead of them.
Leapfrog them.
This is our chance, and so they started subsidizing innovation. So anyone wanting to experiment with a new battery or a new car, would get some public support. Now. The consequence of that is that China makes more than half of the world's cars, and the best ones and the cheapest.
And will continue to grow.
Now, the problem is not that China supported innovation; it's that Europe, America, and Australia didn't support innovation.
Well, once again, I guess legacy interest within the market held firm and decided, no, Volkswagen or whatever want to stay with what we spent, a century building, and that latency, was the downside.
Yeah, it's very hard for legacy companies to make those sorts of changes, and this is a general phenomenon.
Yes.
In fact, there was a course at Harvard Business School about that, how the new economy is never built by the main firms in the old. When I was your age, there was one computing company that dominated the world, IBM. In the 80s, they produced 70 or 80% of the world's computers. If you had said then, in 2025 there will be 100,000 times the computing power that there is now. Everyone would have said IBM will be worth more than every other company in the world. Well, they were defeated by 5 different sets of kids in garages because the incumbents always find it hard to uproot the model that made them successful. And so those kids in the garage are now the high value companies on the New York Stock Exchange. So that is a problem of incumbency is generally important. Now, some companies are better at continuing innovation than others. And there's a particularly sad case, I think, Toyota. They were a real pioneer in the battery.
They went to go hydrogen, didn't they, early on? Yeah,
they went hydrogen, and you could not know at the beginning whether hydrogen or batteries was going to win.
Unless you're Michael Liebrecht, and you're probably planning it well ahead.
Well, no, even and then once one gets ahead, costs keep coming down and completely freezes out the other. But even before Toyota went to hydrogen, they made a major commitment to electric cars. First of all, hybrids. The Prius came out at the beginning of the 21st century, and that was a step towards a fully electric car. And they were making headway on that, but took a very big blow during the global financial crisis. And the financial crisis should have been, if capitalism had been working as Schumpeter said it should through creative destruction, the global financial crisis would have been Toyota's moment, because GM, Chrysler and Ford were all insolvent. Toyota would have taken it over and would have kept going with its lower emissions cars. But the American government bailed out those 3 companies, huge subsidies that Toyota did not benefit from in the same way. At the same time, Toyota's general markets were hurt by the global financial crisis, and that caused them to pull back on the innovation. So
the rest is history.
Now, they also backed hydrogen more than was warranted by the realities as they've emerged. That's not so obvious a mistake as a result of outcomes that you only know were inevitable after they've happened.
Yeah, totally. So you on the back of your book, I guess, Superpower, we're in the offices of the Superpower Institute. We've been talking about innovation. We've been talking about the balance of markets and state. Where does the institute sit in relation to that in terms of innovation and where we need to be looking at?
We're in the very detailed modelling I did in my 2008 review, and we didn't get around to talking to my 2011 review, which was actually implemented.
Of course, yes, I know.
and it hasn't all died. We've still got the Australian Renewable Energy Agency.
It had 2 glorious years, didn't
it?
But
everything other than the carbon price has continued.
Okay.
Matt Keane today brings out the recommendations on targets from the Climate Change Authority. That's a recommendation from the second climate change review. Regrettably, carbon pricing is very important. Didn't talk about that another day. But in my very detailed modelling of the economy for the first climate change review, I had to make certain assumptions about the costs of the new technologies.
Yes.
And that was published 2008, and I introduced an assumption that the cost of solar energy, for example, would fall because of technological improvement by a few % per annum.
Yeah.
And that was based on consultations.
Everyone else thought the same.
No, everyone else was lower.
Okay, right, okay.
And so the criticism of my report was, you've over-egged the pudding. It won't be as good as that.
So everyone underestimated the drops in costs.
And we underestimated less.
Yeah.
By 2015, it was obvious to me that underestimation was big. Between 2008 and 2015, the solar costs had fallen about 80%. And that transformed the whole energy equation. And it meant that a country like Australia, with very rich solar and wind resources, would actually have huge advantages in the zero carbon world economy. I made I gave a public lecture in the first half of 2015 at the University of Adelaide Engineering School called Australia, Superpower of the Zero Carbon World Economy, in which I drew out those implications. That became the book Superpower in 2019, and some of us continued to work on it. Some within the companies and energy that with colleagues in and friends in WA and South Australia, Raymond Spencer in South Australia. We built up Zen Energy, and we incubated research on these things that reached the stage where it was too important just to stay in a commercial entity. So with Rod Sims, we decided to set, and Susanna Powell, who'd been working on these things for some time, we worked on building an independent, philanthropically funded organisation. That's what the Superpower Institute is, to research and publicise Australia's opportunities in the zero carbon world. And these opportunities are very, very large. First, for Australian prosperity, these new industries can contribute more to Australian incomes and living standards, more than the old coal and gas industries can. So we can lose the coal and gas industries and overall be better off because we've nurtured the new ones. Now, you've got to do a lot of policy innovation for that, and so one of the things we work on at the Superpower Institute is the policy innovation. One of the things we work on is just the economic analysis of the scale of these industries, what they depend on. We've got a tremendous group of young people working on these things. You've seen some of the products of them, the new energy trade paper, the green iron paper, and over time we hope to explain to more and more Australians how large this opportunity is, how the policies that are necessary to get us there, and also the contribution we can make not only to Australians' prosperity but to the world climate.
Yes.
Because the paper, The New Energy Trade, and I see that you've got a summary.
I have,
A summary here. That shows that Australia can reduce global emissions by 10%. That's just about as many emissions as the United States has.
It is.
It's more emissions than the European Union has by exporting zero carbon goods. And that will happen if we get the economics right.
Right.
And it's even more valuable to global emissions than reducing global emissions by 10% is, because that's the hardest 10% for the rest of the world.
Yes.
Extreme cases, countries with very little land and lots of incomes and industry, like Singapore and the economy of Taiwan, they don't have anything like the renewable energy resources, even to start to decarbonise industry. Japan and Korea have some renewable energy resources, but they'll run out long before decarbonisation. Less extreme again, but still the same issue in China and in Europe. And in future with the same issue in South Asia and India and Southeast Asia and Indonesia. And now the hardest thing for them to decarbonise is going to be the industry that requires renewable energy and biomass. Australia reduces global emissions by 10% by supplying goods to them. And that's 10% they might never be able to decarbonise themselves.
The hard to
so that's a really decisive contribution to global mitigation.
We just have to figure out a way of adding value to our minerals.
Well, this is the story.
Which is the story. Before you go, one last question. What makes you feel positive? What do you most keeps you awake at night?
Well, the challenges are daunting. The world's not doing very well at the moment. Australia's not doing very well at the moment. Australian very good objectives by the Commonwealth government and all of the state governments except Queensland. And at a state level, this has mostly been bipartisan. Not bipartisan, of course, at the federal level, but despite the very good objectives, we're not making progress because we haven't yet got the policies right. And that's something that the Superpower Institute hopes to be able to contribute to. what keeps me positive, that human history zigs and zags. And in the darkest of moments, when a realistic assessment might be that civilizations headed for the dustbin of history, we've seen changes that have revived the prospects of humanity. It was the darkest days of Hitler's domination of Europe that saw a commitment of the United States to global development, global security, global open trade, that carried us, after the defeat of Nazism and Japanese imperialism, that carried us through several decades of the most marvelous development. In many countries, democratic development. In many countries, democratic development in after periods of military dictatorship. Obviously, Germany and Japan, but also Indonesia and Korea and Taiwan. Who in 1941, after the fall of France, would have thought that possible? Yes. So human history zigs and zags, and that's our chance.
Okay, very good. Thank you.